The laughter started the moment Elias Walker raised the center pole. Not because the structure looked weak, because it looked temporary. A cone of long timber poles lashed together at the top, wrapped tightly in layered canvas and animal hides, standing alone in the frozen valley where every other family built square wooden cabins with thick roofs and stone chimneys. To the people of Bitter Creek, Elias's shelter looked less like a home and more like something a traveler abandoned overnight. A tent. Harlan Pike laughed openly. You planning to survive winter or go camping in it? Others joined in. You can't live through January in canvas. One good storm will flatten the thing. Should have spent that effort building real walls. Elias ignored every word. Because unlike most people in Bitter Creek, he had seen what blizzards actually did to rigid buildings. 5 years earlier, he worked freight routes far north with indigenous hunting parties that crossed open tundra during storms powerful enough to erase entire campsites in minutes. Their shelters survived because they bent. Because wind moved around them instead of striking flat walls head-on. That lesson stayed with him long after he returned south. Especially after his father died inside a collapsed cabin during the heavy snow winter 3 years earlier. The roof failed first, then the chimney. By the time neighbors dug through the drifted snow, the cold had already finished the rest. Most people blamed bad luck. Elias blamed the building itself. Too rigid, too heavy, too vulnerable to pressure. So when he inherited a small patch of frozen land near Bitter Creek, he built differently. Not quickly, carefully. The central pole came first, anchored deep into packed earth beneath the frost line. Around it, Elias raised a ring of long lodgepole timbers angled sharply enough that snow would slide instead of collect. Then came the canvas. Not one layer. 3. Heavy outer canvas treated with animal fat and oil against moisture. Thick wool blankets beneath that. Then an inner hide lining trapping insulating air between every layer. At the base, Elias buried the lower edges beneath packed snow and frozen earth, creating a sealed wind barrier around the entire structure. The final result looked strange against the square cabins surrounding it. Low, rounded, almost alive beneath blowing snow. Children from the valley came specifically to stare at it. Looks like a giant snow teepee. In some ways it was. But Elias understood something the others didn't. The strongest winter shelter isn't always the heaviest. Sometimes it's the one winter can't grab hold of. Caleb Turner visited first while Elias finished sealing the outer canvas layers before first frost. You seriously planning to stay in this thing all winter? Elias tightened another rope anchor into the frozen ground. I'm planning for the wind. Caleb glanced toward the nearby cabins. Cabins handle wind fine. No, Elias said calmly. Cabins resist wind. Different thing. Caleb frowned. Elias pointed toward the angled walls of the shelter. Storm hits flat walls, pressure builds. Snow collects. Ice forms. Weight increases. Then he pointed toward the curved tent shape. Storm hits this and slides away. Caleb still looked doubtful. Because the structure simply didn't look solid enough. That was the problem. People trusted weight, mass, thickness. But Elias trusted movement. Flexibility. Aerodynamics. The first winter winds arrived early that year. Sharp northern gusts rolled across Bitter Creek hard enough to shake loose shutters and rattle cabin roofs before November even began. Elias sat inside the tent shelter listening carefully. The difference surprised even him. The wind didn't slam against the structure. It flowed around it. Canvas flexed slightly beneath stronger gusts instead of resisting them directly. The angled poles distributed pressure evenly downward into the earth, while the rounded shape prevented snowdrifts from piling heavily against any single surface. Most importantly, the interior stayed warmer than expected. Not because the shelter trapped huge heat, because it trapped small heat efficiently. A modest central stove position beneath the vent opening warmed the insulated air layers surprisingly well. The circular shape distributed heat evenly, while the layered canvas walls reduced drafts better than poorly sealed timber cabins. Elias burned less wood than nearly everyone else in the valley during the first cold weeks. That alone drew attention. Harlan Pike noticed first. You hauling less firewood already? Using less. Harlan laughed again. Wait till January. Maybe you would have been right. Except January never arrived normally that year. By early December, strange weather rolled down from the north faster than expected. Heavy pressure drops. Violent crosswinds. dry snow blowing across the valley in long white streaks. Old ranchers started watching the sky too carefully. That always meant trouble. Then the warnings came. 40-year storm. Worst blizzard since the Black Winter. People rushed to reinforce roofs and stack extra wood against cabin walls. Families tied ropes between buildings so nobody would get lost crossing yards during whiteouts. Elias did something different. He lowered his shelter slightly. Extra support ropes anchored deeper into frozen ground. Snow packed deliberately around the base for additional insulation and wind sealing. Flexible pull joints adjusted to allow slight movement instead of rigid resistance. Caleb watched nervously. You really think this thing survives what's coming? Elias looked toward the growing northern clouds. I think rigid things break first. The storm arrived 2 nights later, and Bitter Creek disappeared beneath it. Wind screamed across the valley hard enough to shake entire buildings. Snow blasted sideways so violently people lost sight of neighboring cabins only yards away. Inside Elias's shelter, the canvas walls flexed and groaned beneath gusts. But never cracked, never split. The storm couldn't grab it properly. Wind flowed around the rounded structure instead of striking flat surfaces directly. Snow slid continuously down the steep sides instead of piling dangerously across the roof. Hour after hour the shelter moved with the storm instead of fighting against it. That frightened Elias more than if it failed immediately, because outside, he could already hear timber buildings beginning to break. Then sometime after midnight, a distant crashing sound rolled across the blizzard. The crashing sound came again, longer this time, timber snapping beneath pressure. Then another, and another. Elias sat upright beside the small stove listening to the storm tear through Bitter Creek. Cabins were failing. He knew the sound too well. Heavy snow packed against flat walls and roofs, while violent crosswinds pushed entire structures sideways. Once one beam cracked, the rest usually followed quickly after. Inside the tent shelter, the canvas flexed hard beneath a powerful gust, then settled again. Not resisting, yielding. The difference mattered. Snow continued sliding down the steep angled sides instead of collecting heavily on top. Wind wrapped around the curved structure instead of striking broad flat walls directly. The storm couldn't find purchase. Then came the pounding. 3 frantic hits against the entrance flap nearly vanished beneath the blizzard noise outside. Elias grabbed the lantern immediately and forced the outer flap open against screaming wind. Caleb Turner practically fell inside, carrying his younger sister beneath one arm. Snow exploded inward behind them before Elias sealed the flap shut again. For several seconds none of them spoke. They simply stood there breathing hard while the shelter swayed gently around them. Not dangerously. Naturally. Caleb stared upward in disbelief. It's still standing. Elias handed blankets toward his sister. What happened? Our roof collapsed. Caleb's voice shook. Whole north side gave out under the drift. Another heavy gust slammed across the valley outside. The tent bent slightly with it, then straightened. Still intact. Caleb looked around slowly. The interior felt surprisingly warm. Not hot, but stable. The circular shape trapped heat evenly around the central stove while the insulated air layers between canvas, wool, and hide slowed heat loss far better than anyone expected. Most importantly, no drafts. No freezing corners. No icy wind slipping through cracked boards. The shelter moved with the storm instead of cracking against it. More pounding interrupted them minutes later. This time it was Harlan Pike and his wife half buried in snow. Then the Millers. Then old Mr. Wexler wrapped in blankets after his chimney collapsed through the cabin roof. By dawn, nearly a dozen people crowded inside Elias Walker's joke tent. Nobody laughed anymore. The blizzard worsened through the night. Outside, Bitter Creek disappeared beneath moving walls of snow. Several cabins partially collapsed under drift pressure, while others lost roofs entirely. Chimneys snapped. Frozen wind forced itself through timber cracks faster than fires could compensate. But the tent remained standing, because the storm couldn't corner it. Every part of the structure worked together naturally. Rounded shape, flexible frame, steep walls, minimal surface resistance. Even the buried lower edges mattered enormously now. Packed snow around the base created extra insulation while sealing out freezing ground-level wind completely. Caleb finally understood. Your shelter isn't fighting the storm. Elias added another modest piece of wood to the stove. No. The canvas shifted softly overhead beneath another gust. It's surviving the movement. That sentence stayed with everyone inside. Because outside, every rigid structure in the valley was locked in battle against the storm constantly. Inside the tent, survival felt strangely calmer. The structure adapted instead of resisted. Around 3 in the morning, one violent gust struck hard enough to force snow beneath the outer entrance flap. Several people panicked immediately, but Elias simply tightened the inner rope braces and waited. The shelter flexed deeply. The center pole creaked. Then the entire structure settled again, naturally beneath the wind load. Nothing cracked. Nothing split. Because pressure distributed evenly throughout the frame, instead of concentrating at rigid corners. Harlan stared upward wide-eyed. A cabin would have snapped. Elias nodded quietly. Corners fail first. The storm continued nearly 2 full days. 2 endless days of shrieking wind and crushing snow. Inside the tent shelter, people survived mostly because the structure demanded surprisingly little fuel. The insulated air layers trapped warmth efficiently, while the circular design prevented cold pockets from forming. The stove never needed roaring heat. Only steady heat. That difference saved their wood supply. By the second night, several families admitted something difficult aloud. The tent felt safer than their cabins ever had. Not stronger. Smarter. That realization unsettled the entire valley once the blizzard finally weakened. When dawn arrived clear and bitterly cold on the 3rd morning, Elias stepped outside first. Bitter Creek looked destroyed. Snow buried fences completely. Several cabin roofs collapsed inward under drift weight. One chimney lay shattered across the street. Entire sheds vanished beneath packed snow. But the tent still stood calmly in the center of the valley. Canvas coated white with frost. Smoke rising steadily from the vent opening. Untouched. People emerged slowly from damaged homes, staring openly at the structure they mocked only days earlier. Now it looked different somehow. Not temporary. Adapted. Word spread quickly after that winter. The flexible tent survived the 40-year storm better than the timber cabins. The rounded walls shed snow naturally. The layered insulation held heat with less fuel. Most importantly, the structure bent instead of breaking. By spring, several families began copying parts of Elias's design. Rounded roof lines, flexible support joints, layered insulation systems. Some even built emergency storm shelters using canvas and angled poles specifically for blizzard survival. Nobody laughed about tents anymore. The storm ended that permanently. Snow melted slowly across Bitter Creek that spring. One evening Caleb stood beside Elias watching sunset glow against the now famous shelter. "You know what bothers everyone most?" he asked. "That they were wrong?" Caleb smiled faintly. "That the strongest home in the valley looked like the weakest one." Elias glanced toward the rounded structure, standing quietly against the thawing landscape. People spent their lives believing survival meant building harder walls. But winter taught a different lesson. Sometimes the things that endure longest aren't the ones that resist force best. They're the ones flexible enough to move with it. And long after the 40-year blizzard passed into Bitter Creek legend, travelers still stopped to stare at the strange canvas shelter, standing where collapsed cabins once failed. Most expected weakness. Instead, they found the only home the storm could not break.